Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes and welcome to Books My Dad, who's a PhD in English literature, thinks I should read because reading them improves my understanding of good literature, also known as Gwen aimlessly chatters about real literature or desperately tries not to sneeze while she's talking. So this week's book is kind of odd in that I read it and I really enjoyed it, and I don't want to read any of the rest of the series because the rest of the series will not be like this and will thus be disappointing. So what is this book? Well, this book is by Josephine Tey, and it's part of a murder mystery series. It's starring an Inspector Detective Alan Grant, and he, solves mysteries. And most of the time, he's a police detective who goes around and solving mysteries. He's an English one, and this is roughly, I would say, immediately post-war England, give or take. Anyways, so most of the series is that. And then there's this one book, which I am told caused so much controversy that apparently a bunch of academics leapt up to defy the statement of this book and say that it was wrong, because apparently people aren't allowed to write fiction anymore, or something like that. So what is this book? Josephine Tey's The Daughter of Time. Now, The Daughter of Time, this title, doesn't have anything to do with Mr. Alan Grant, and it doesn't have to do with the painting, which is apparently a panel painting by an anonymous unknown artist, or so the Encyclopedia Britannica informs me, is all the information that they're willing to give out, and is apparently all the information that the National Gallery in London, England was willing to give out about this particular panel painting, which is a painting of the shockingly notorious King Richard III. No, this title comes apparently from an epigraph, Truth is the Daughter of Time. I would assume based on the idea that enough time passes and eventually truths will out because everybody who might have cared to hide it will be dead, and so everybody else can find out what happened. Or that kind of thing. So, what is this book about? Well, Detective Grant has been seriously injured. And he's particularly aggravated because it was apparently due to some sort of a trip and fall during the course of chasing after some criminal or other, and it wasn't because, he got beaten or anything heroic or manly. No, it was just he tripped over his own feet, and that's just a humiliating way to wind up in the hospital. And he's bored out of his skull. And people have brought him books, and they're all horrible. The nurses are telling him, well, why don't you read some of the books people brought you? And they're all books like A Pretty Picture of Valletta in Unlikely Pink was Lavinia Fitch's annual account of a blameless heroine's tribulations. The Sweat and the Furrow was Silas Weekly being earthy and spade conscious, all over 700 pages. And then there is Under the Harsh Shadows and Highlights of Silas's Jacket was an elegant affair of Edwardian curlicues and Baroque nonsense entitled Bells on Her Toes, which was Rupert Rouge being arch about vice. Rupert Rouge always seduced you until after for the first 3 pages. About page 3 you notice that Rupert had learned from that very arch, but of course not vicious creature George Bernard Shaw, that the easiest way to sound witty was to use that cheap and convenient method, the paradox. After that you could see the jokes coming 3 sentences away. The Case of the Missing Tin Opener by John James Mark had 3 errors of procedure in the first 2 pages, and had at least provided Grant with a pleasant 5 minutes while he composed an imaginary letter to its author. He's basically, looking at this stack of books and doesn't want to read any of them because they're all aggravating. And then effectively a friend of his, Marta Hallard, who is something of a star of the stage, has decided to winds up bringing him a bunch of pictures to look at. That is, pictures of famous people from history, about whom there are some sort of mysteries. Now, Richard III isn't much of a mystery, per se. You know, his younger brother, his older brother Edward, rather, was king, and then the king died, and the king's two young sons were being kept in the Tower of London, which presently in the present of the book in particular, which is the mid-20th century, the Tower was seen as some sort of prison, but was at the time, in fact, a royal residence, and you kept some people locked up because there wasn't a convenient jail, but being sent to the Tower wasn't like being sent to, the depths of the Bastille, which also apparently only had like 20 people in it at the time of the French Revolution. Anyways. And Richard III is known for being the monster who murdered his two young nephews because he wanted to make sure he could keep the throne. Ooh, ah. And then he died in a battle, and, he's one of the great villains of Shakespeare. The man who said, a horse, my kingdom for a horse, and all of that. And so Grant's friend brings him a bunch of pictures of people about whom there was some sort of mystery, and somehow Richard III got mixed up in it. And he looks at this picture, and he, with his gut instinct, his approach as a man who solves a lot of mysteries, who has to talk to a lot of people, who has to figure out who is guilty and who isn't, and who you should be following up on and so forth, and looked at him and said, this isn't a man who would kill for no reason. This isn't a guy who would this isn't a man who would murder his nephews just for power or not, and anything else. And as he shows the picture to people and, says, if I don't tell you who this is, what do you think he is? And some people say, well, he looks like he's been ill. And some people say, well, he looks like a particularly sober and responsible judge, and that sort of thing. Nobody says, oh, this is a man who's clearly a murderer. He doesn't look like it. And at that point, Grant becomes curious, because, of course, all the books say that he murdered his nephews, and you have this story that starts to build, and then he starts doing research into it and finds things like that the version of the story that is most told and most relied upon was told by a man who was 5 years old at the time of the murder and was in fact working for the administration that followed. That is, Richard is the last of the Plantagenets, and you have the next the next ones who took over. I can't remember the family name because, frankly, the history of English royalty isn't something I have spent too much time concerning myself with. The ones in between Plantagenets and Stuarts, Queen Elizabeth, and so on et al. Anyways, that Thomas More, who is known as being, careful and responsible and a good man and all this kind of stuff, that what was in his book was just propaganda, the party line. And then it turned out that this particular piece of propaganda wasn't even something that he had specifically published. Thomas More hadn't published. It was something he had copied out from someone else's account that he had not yet, in fact, placed into a book, and that it kind of got stuck in and sent out under his name, but it wasn't, in fact, him. And Grant goes through a great deal of trouble going through, basically investigating this, and has a young American man who has gotten a job at the British Museum do a lot of legwork for him, looking for records, that is, hard factual records, not somebody's historical account of what happened, but records of, we know that, King Richard went here because there is a record of him doing this and going here on that day, and, they ordered this many people to follow him, and he sent a letter to do that. And they wind up building up a picture that Richard had been a very, very good king, had not killed his nephews, had done all sorts of very, very careful things to try to bring about peace between the two sides who had been in the War of the Roses, and all of this stuff, and that it was his successor, Henry, who had, among other things, immediately following the battle in which Richard was killed, had retroactively declared all of the men fighting on Richard's side to have committed treason, even though they were men fighting for the then sitting King of England, which means that none of their behavior was in the slightest treasonous. And he winds up working through this with the assistance of his young American friend, and at the end of this book, they come to the conclusion that Richard has been maligned by history, and that he should have, and that it was Henry who murdered the boys in the tower. And when this book was over, apparently there was a massive, according to my father, who after all, pays attention to this stuff, there was apparently some sort of massive upset in academia from people who felt that they had to defend the position that Richard III had been a monster and all of the things he has been accused of. And this is it's a really, really interesting book, in no small part because you're getting to follow the trail of historical research, how real historical research, real archaeology, real history functions, how you really find things out, how you find out what actually happened, how you follow those trails. And it's combined with this man who is stuck in a hospital bed and can't go anywhere, and has set himself to treating this like a murder mystery. And it's just really, really interesting and a really delightful read. And I can't speak to the rest of the series. It's probably reasonably good because, first of all, you don't get to publish a bunch of books if there aren't some people buying them. But if they're, even half as good as this book, then they're probably pretty good. But this one is very, very different because it's not very often that people write books that are, in effect, telling the story of the process of somebody doing research. And that's what this is. And it's interesting, especially because, of course, it's very interesting research, but I have no patience, which is why I would never wind up doing that myself. This is a rarity in that I can recommend it wholeheartedly, not just because somebody with more literary chops than I have recommends it, but because I actually enjoyed it. This is, to me at least, it's a page turner and it's fun, and it's just a lot of thinky thoughts. It's really just a lot of thinky thoughts, which is very entertaining. Now, I don't know enough about Richard III, and maybe there's a lot of counterweight argument to what is proposed in this book, but I think it's just worth the read. So that's everything on this particular book, and I will see you all next week.